Well, howdy folks, and welcome back to the farm. Today we're going to jump right into Volume 3 of Why Stanley Kubrick. So far, in Volumes 1 and 2, we covered Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Then we covered, of course, 2001, A Space Odyssey. And then, in our last volume, we started talking about A Clockwork Orange, and we completely lost track of time because I'm both fascinated and horrified by that movie. I find it to be a brilliant artistic achievement, but also an awful, harrowing experience to actually watch. And I find that contradiction very strange and interesting. I mean, okay, yeah, it was a low budget. Kubrick only spent $2 million to make it. But, I mean, that was a very interesting use of $2 million. You know, plastic eyeballs used as cufflinks, giant female mannequins that dispense milk laced with psychoactive drugs through their presumably plastic breasts. Yeah, it's that kind of movie. Now, I know so far it seems like I've been very spoiler heavy, but I have left a lot of details unspoken, and these are the details that I think make the movie interesting. And I'm talking about how Alex interacts with his droogs, with his friends, and how goofy his parents are, and how they're clueless about his doings and goings-on, and where he is at night. And then the bizarre mannerisms of the prison and government staff, the interesting twists of fate, and some unlikely circumstances that come together to move Alex's story forward. He's almost like a pinball bouncing around inside a machine in the third reel of this movie, because now that he's had his agency taken away from him by the Ludovico treatment, he's just sort of a victim that things happen to. And so, in the last volume, I did sort of skip over the details of the Ludovico treatment.
I must interrupt here since you neglected to mention it. Ludovico is the Italian version of the German name Ludwig. This is interesting because Ludwig van Beethoven inadvertently figures prominently in this treatment.
As I said in the last volume, the quote-unquote doctors in their white lab coats take Alex to a movie theater and strap him to a chair, his body and his head, so that he can't look away from the screen. They use stainless steel metal clamps to clamp his eyes open, and they begin to play films for him. And someone sits next to him in the very next theater seat, and their task is to use an eyedropper to drop artificial tears into Alex's eyes so they don't dry out while he's being forced to watch these scenes of sexual assault and torture and murder and beatings and stabbings all day, every day, while he is injected with this substance that rewires his responses to these images and begins to neurologically associate a feeling of extreme dread, a feeling that you're about to die, combined with a kind of nausea and helplessness. Now, here's where a little problem comes up. It's never made clear, in the movie at least, whether or not the doctors knew that Alex was a big fan of classical music, and in particular Beethoven. But for some reason, one of these films had a soundtrack. And behind all of the death and the mutilation, we start to hear Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, classical music being played over these awful visuals, which is, in a strange way, kind of an intense distillation or echo of the film at large, because that's what this movie is, kind of. Disturbing visuals mixed with beautiful classical music. And so, when Alex hears Beethoven in his terrible state, and he realizes that Beethoven is going to be associated with this feeling of dread and horrible fear and helplessness, once he realizes that this is going to damage his ability to appreciate music, that's when the real horror sinks in. And for the first time, he freaks out and starts yelling, and he wants the doctors to turn off the music. And he begs them to turn off the music and appeals to their basic role as members of our civilization. And it's a sin to do this to another human. Well, it's very convenient that Alex has just discovered that there are some things you shouldn't do to other people. A little late now. And the doctors agreed, and they did not turn off the music. And one of the climaxes of the film, probably, in a psychological sense, before Alex's release, the prison organizes a demonstration of Alex's new condition for the edification and education of the government and the public. They invited journalists and government officials to come witness what they've done to Alex. And during this quote-unquote press conference, Alex is brought out on a stage in front of the crowd, and he's dressed in a nice suit, and he looks like a very decent young man now. Then they bring people out on stage to interact with Alex, and things don't go so well. At least, not for Alex. But the officials of the prison and the government officials are thrilled with the results. So first, they have a guy come out, just an ordinary-looking guy in another suit. He just starts calling Alex names and abusing him in a way that keeps escalating. And we see that Alex can't fight back. And at one point, Alex, in his attempt to defend himself, gets this sudden surge of weakness and nausea, and he just collapses into a fetal position on the stage. But his tormentor and stage partner is not nearly done with him yet, and so he stomps on his chest to get him to roll over flat. And during this stomping is when the actor who plays Alex, Malcolm McDowell, had a rib broken by the stomping motion during that scene. After stomping Alex with that shoe, he holds the shoe over Alex's face, and he orders Alex to lick the sole of his shoe, and Alex is completely helpless, and in a desperate attempt to get the guy to stop abusing him, the camera fixes on a close-up of Alex's face with the sole of that guy's shoe, like 1 inch over it, almost touching his nose. And Alex, horrified by what he's doing, sticks his tongue out and gives the sole of the guy's shoe a long lick. Now, surprisingly, Kubrick allowed the actor to switch shoes between shots so that the shoe that's right over Alex's face had never actually been worn before, and the soles were determined to be very clean. I'm surprised by that. I would think that Kubrick's obsession with getting details right would require that the sole be filthy, visibly dirty, when Alex licks it. And then there was a close-up of, the gravel and the dust on Alex's tongue. I would have expected that, but I guess Kubrick was in a good mood, and he had already broken the guy's rib, and so I guess he felt bad about making him lick a dirty shoe on top of that on the same day. Now, if they were two different scenes, then maybe Kubrick would make him do that. But, not on the same day, not in the same scene, Kubrick had his limits. He wasn't a monster. Well, after Alex licks the shoe, he's not done yet. It's time for the real test. After his tormentor leaves the stage, Alex is able to gather himself enough to get up off the floor, but then a half-naked woman walks out on stage and begins walking very seductively toward Alex, trying to arouse him. And we can tell that he was aroused by the woman because he once again collapses into nausea and dread and helplessness in a fetal position. This is now his new reaction to being aroused. So, they've taken away Alex's ability to commit violence. They've taken away his ability to be sexual at all. And so, now that he's been proven to be a sort of semi-deactivated person, the government officials, the prison officials, and the press are all elated, and they cheer because they've found a solution to the crime, finally. So Alex has graduated, and in the third part of the movie, we see Alex run into a lot of people from his past that he had wronged and who were seeking revenge, understandably so, given what a disgusting monster he was in the first third of the movie. And so the first thing Alex thinks to do is to go home and see his parents, and see if he could stay there, at least for a while. Well, his parents didn't adjust too well to finding out that their son was a serial rapist and murderer. So they didn't visit him, apparently, and they allowed another young man to rent out Alex's room as a boarder for extra money. So when Alex shows up with his little bag that contains everything he owns in the world, he finds his parents having dinner with the boarder, this guy that the parents have clearly sort of taken on as their new son during the years when Alex was away. And they basically tell Alex that this other young man has signed a contract, and Alex isn't really all that welcome there anymore anyway. And here's where I need to mention that most people at some point discover that Alex's father is being played by the same actor who played Delbert Grady, the caretaker of the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, the ghost that Jack Nicholson's character meets in the strange orange and white bathroom. This is the ghost of the man who hacked his family to pieces with an axe, according to the story in The Shining. Anyway, it's weird seeing Delbert Grady play a kind of helpless doofus dad. He probably should have taken the axe to Alex when he was young. He would have saved a lot of people a lot of pain. So, Alex is treated very poorly in the third reel of the film, as I mentioned. I have to mention here that during this portion of the film, the actor Malcolm McDowell almost drowned during one scene. It's a scene where someone is holding his head underwater while they're beating him, and there's no CGI involved, no stealth cuts. Malcolm McDowell just holds his breath for a super long time while he's being hit with rubber truncheons. The turning point kind of comes when Alex runs into one person in particular who has a deep hatred of him. And this person happens to find out not only that this strange young man is the same teenager who had done a horrible thing to him in the past, so he knows who Alex is. He knows something even worse for Alex. This man knows that Alex has the same reaction to Beethoven that he does to being aroused by a woman or angered, or if he's attacked with violence and he wants to retaliate. And so this leads to one of the most bizarre scenes I've ever seen. I wonder if this is what put Kubrick over the edge as far as, oh, I've got to make this movie because I want to film this scene. So Alex is locked in a room with a good sound system. and someone blasts Beethoven at the top of the volume for Alex's listening pleasure. And Alex is so neurologically affected by Beethoven that he's dry heaving and crawling on the floor, and eventually he has to jump out the window and attempt suicide because he can't listen to Beethoven anymore. Well, I'll go ahead and say Alex survives the fall, and the Ludovico treatment becomes a hot potato and a major subject in the media. And the government is forced to change its policies. And so I won't give the details of the ending, but when we talk about the ending, we have to mention that there were two endings to the novel. Anthony Burgess originally wrote a version that had a more disturbing, less happy ending, an ending where Alex was actually restored to his previous self, and then, in compensation for what had been done to him, he was given a government job. So Alex ends the story as a man who dreams of sexual assault and murder, but now has a nice job and his whole life is waiting ahead of him, which is a disturbing thought. And so later, Anthony Burgess, I believe, at the request of publishers, wrote a sort of coda or epilogue where Alex uses his restored free will to do good. He actually reforms, like people should, through his own self-awareness and self-discipline. It was a satisfying, happy, wholesome ending that reinforced our assumptions about our society and the future. And so Stanley Kubrick was having none of that. He hated this ending. And so he was determined that the movie would keep the original disturbing ending. And so now we have this beautiful and horrific masterpiece called A Clockwork Orange. So how was this movie received by the public? What did people think about it when it came out? Well, it was promptly banned in the UK for 25 years. It's very ironic that a movie that was filmed in Great Britain could not be seen by the people that lived in Great Britain. Now, the British government was motivated to ban A Clockwork Orange due to public outcry from some copycat murders and attacks that had happened, because the movie makes Alex a very memorable and engaging character. And so it's difficult to see the movie and not feel some sort of empathy with Alex, especially in the second and third parts of the movie. And because of that, Kubrick was accused of being, I guess, pro-violence, pro-sexual assault, and sort of seeing the world vicariously through Alex DeLarge, especially Alex's attitudes toward women. Now, Kubrick's feelings about women and how they're portrayed in his movies is kind of an issue. There's a couple of things I find interesting about sort of what Kubrick is saying about sexuality, maybe. And Alex is obviously portrayed as a dangerous sexual predator. But we also see Alex picking up teenage girls for a consensual and enthusiastic three-way sexual encounter at his apartment, where he lives with his parents, who are presumably at work. And this teenager threesome occurs in broad daylight during the day when all three of them should be in school. But not in this future. We don't care about education or the discipline of the youth in this world. This is some sort of bizarre, nominally socialist, but de facto totalitarian nightmare where there are no real families. Just children running around trying to gratify themselves with no sort of overarching belief system. And so Kubrick was actually criticizing the counterculture, in a way, I think. Steven Spielberg referred to A Clockwork Orange as the first punk rock movie. But I think that Kubrick was actually criticizing that attitude and that movement, because with A Clockwork Orange, he seems to show us the final result of all this. I think he sees Alex's world as the world you get when too many people embrace the counterculture, when too many people want to live out the social and political ideals of Easy Rider, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Apocalypse Now, The Godfather, or A Fistful of Dollars. These are movies about loners, drifters, people who don't fit in, people who take what they want, using their own initiative and cleverness. It's not about learning to live harmoniously within an established social order. The movies of the time were about kicking over the social order because it was rotten. So in a way, Kubrick was trying to out Easy Rider the anti-hero sentiments in those films. I think that Kubrick wanted us to bear in mind or remember some of the messages about sexuality in the movie. And that's because of how visually or temporally prominent these moments are. And one in particular is the threesome, which luckily is portrayed all by adults, even though they're supposed to be in high school. Kubrick filmed the entire experience, the entire sexual experience between the three nude people on Alex's bed, but it was filmed so that when you played it back, it was in fast motion. It was sped up so that the whole thing only took a couple of minutes, but the people were like jumping around like acrobats in the nude to perform what they wanted to perform. And then the whole thing was set to the inspiring sounds of the William Tell Overture. So, needless to say, probably one of the strangest sex scenes in cinema history. And I think it's a stroke of genius because he's able to literally show this sort of unusual sexual encounter, but it's this cold, dry, boring, uninteresting, mechanical thing. And I think that's brilliant. He uses his competence in the art of cinema to reduce sex to something that we can see graphically, but is just sort of blah and mechanical. That's a beautiful way to put us in Alex's position. Clearly, sex is not anything particularly special or interesting to Alex. It's just sort of a bodily function that he performs regularly. He actually calls it the old in and out. No time for the old in and out today, love. I just came to read the meter. The other image I think of is during the demonstration that the government puts on of what they've done to Alex. And when the half-nude woman walks out on stage, her arrival is marked as a significant moment, not only by the music, but also by the lighting and the overall slow pace of the scene. The pace slows way down when she arrives, and we see Alex's reaction as he collapses, feeling violently ill. And Kubrick kind of lingers on this powerful shot, looking up at this statuesque woman standing over a collapsed Alex. And it's almost like a revenge for what Alex has done to women in the past. And you're tempted to think that Kubrick himself found this image pretty disturbing. If you interpret Kubrick's work as the musings of someone who occasionally dabbled in misogyny, then you can see how Kubrick thought this image of the woman overpowering the man, and he's powerless to do anything to her. He's just a child, basically, a helpless infant around her. And since we know that Kubrick is trying to paint a nightmare for us, Kubrick is trying to create this oppressive world where all the rules are thrown out the window. What if he's telling us, hey, one of these rules is the power of men over women. And if we keep up this counterculture stuff, you're going to have women having power over men. And that's just as terrible as having these milk-crazed teenagers beating up old people in the streets. I don't really think that. I think Kubrick just thought the image was emotionally powerful and very cool, and it fit what he was trying to say in that scene. I think he was trying to highlight the helplessness and humiliation of Alex at that point. I'm not sure he was trying to make a commentary about men in general and women in general. But let me go ahead and say what I really think. I think Stanley Kubrick is a misogynist. But that's okay. And it's not sexist. Because he's also a misandrist. Stanley Kubrick is a misanthrope, meaning he has a low opinion of all humans, or at least most, including men and women. So I say, if you hate the genders equally, if you hate all the races equally, then you're fine. You're not a misogynist or a racist. You're playing fair. Stanley Kubrick cast a very wide net of disdain and disapproval, and all kinds of people got tangled up in it, not just women. We're going to talk much more about this in the next volume on Stanley Kubrick when we talk about The Shining, because the way Stanley Kubrick wrote the lead female character and his treatment of that actress is the stuff of legend. Ugly Hollywood legends. But enough about A Clockwork Orange, for now. I'm sure at some point I'll refer back to it. But now it's time to move on to Barry Lyndon. The cool thing about Barry Lyndon is how completely different it is from all other Stanley Kubrick movies. And it proves that Kubrick was very versatile and not just a one-trick pony. He wasn't just good at weird science fiction movies or black comedies. Kubrick had just completed 2 movies about a disturbing near future, and then he jumps directly into the past, into a movie set in the 1780s, in a very, very quaint and traditional past. This movie is very long. It's about 3 hours long, and it has a very slow pace. It has kind of an epic scale. It covers most of this one person's adult life, a young, poor Irish farm boy named Redmond Barry. He changes his name to Barry Lyndon later. But the thing about this movie is you have to really look at it. It has much less dialogue than your typical period piece. In fact, one reviewer called it almost a silent movie, where it's just music and then this voiceover narration that kind of explains what the characters are thinking or planning at the time. It really is a kind of picture book on the screen, because every frame of the film looks like a painting. And so during an interview, Kubrick was told about this critic who had said that Barry Lyndon was a silent movie. And Kubrick's response was, "Oh, good. He gets it. It was a silent movie." Kubrick explained that the silent movies got a lot of things right in terms of visual storytelling that the talkie movies started to deviate from. I like to look in the background and at the costumes, which we're going to talk a lot more about, and the amazing sets, and the extras who are always polishing silverware or scrubbing floors. He really shows the busyness of the world back then. At the same time, there was a lot of leisure. It's cool, you see people on walks or just sitting and watching the sunset while drinking ale. Especially after watching A Clockwork Orange. It's such a peaceful world. And that's a weird word to use, peaceful, because the movie is full of duels, and Redmond fights in wars in Europe in 2 different armies. So we do see a lot of shooting and a pretty cool but brief sword fight. So I get a lot out of the movie, mainly because I'm looking at the photography. And let me say something about that. One thing to know about Barry Lyndon is that Kubrick was committed to shoot the whole movie without any artificial light. He wanted the film exposure to be accomplished only through sunlight or candlelight, usually giant chandeliers of lots of candles, because you have to remember, even the best film stock and the quote-unquote fastest lenses available could not handle low light settings like modern film stocks could by the 90s, or especially digital. Digital can work with very low light, but you couldn't do that in 1974. And so later on, we'll talk about some of the tricks Kubrick had to use. And he did actually have to use an artificial light to mimic moonlight. There was a scene on a balcony at some aristocrat's party. It's supposed to be a full moon, and it just wasn't technically possible to get a good exposure, even from a bright full moon in Britain at the time. And so we have very complex, beautiful cinematography going on. And even though Barry Lyndon wasn't commercially successful, it totally cleaned up at the Oscars. And this is back when the Oscars meant a lot more, when it was less political and more about the skill of the craftsman. And so Barry Lyndon dominated the technical Oscars that year. It received the award for Best Cinematography, Best Costumes, and Best Production Design. And let's talk about these costumes, because the costumes in Barry Lyndon are pretty amazing. They are clearly partly the result of Kubrick's research into his Napoleon epic that he wanted to make, but he never did. But the costumes would have been from roughly the same time period as Barry Lyndon. So he had already done a lot of work in that area. And so to give you a sense of how accurate Kubrick wanted to be, we have to mention that the first thing Kubrick did was try to see how many original pieces he could get for the movie. Looking at restored jackets, coats, trousers, boots, hats that were actually made in the 18th century. And believe it or not, they managed to find quite a bit. And so there are plenty of scenes in Barry Lyndon where you see a really elaborately embroidered coat, and some of them are literally actually real pieces that were made in the 18th century. They had to beg museums and collectors and other sources of vintage garments. And so after that, Kubrick filled in the gaps with modern reproductions, but they had to be reproductions that were made of the same material, using roughly the same methods, so that he could get the most authentic look possible. And so, all the scenes that show the redcoats of the British Army are a little dingy looking. They're not the bright blood red that you see in a lot of Hollywood movies. It's kind of a deep orange. It's definitely red, but it has a kind of dull, rusty look. And this shows, once again, Stanley Kubrick's insane attention to detail and his desire for an immersive kind of realism. And this is, once again, why a lot of people who believe that the moon landings, or at least the first one, was faked, a lot of people who believe that claim that Stanley Kubrick was approached by the deep state to fake the footage. because they knew that Kubrick was the only person that could defeat all the people who wanted to show that the footage was a hoax. They knew that Stanley's insane attention to detail would save them and keep the secret going. Now, I do think we did actually go to the moon. I don't think Stanley Kubrick faked footage for the government. I would like to think that Stanley Kubrick would not do that. Even though I'm about to argue that Stanley Kubrick was very pro-traditional civilization, he was also very critical of it. He believed that you had to be careful to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. There's a way to address racial prejudice or the ugly rough edges of capitalism without creating cultural anarchy or sort of weak socialist governments. So in Barry Lyndon, we definitely get this immersive world, and it's even photographed with natural light so that it looks like paintings from back then. And Kubrick was careful about what makeup he allowed on his actors, so the people looked very natural. And I cannot overstate how different Barry Lyndon is from A Clockwork Orange, where A Clockwork Orange is this cold, disturbing movie. Barry Lyndon is this sort of warm, inviting movie. It's comforting. There's something really comforting about the order of this life and how everybody knows their place and the ornate home furnishings. And you have these scenes where people are talking, but behind them you can see a servant on their hands and knees scrubbing the floors. And then you see people in these beautiful hats and wigs. And we'll talk about this more later. And also the extreme politeness of the characters. There's none of the rude, clipped speech or profanity of the late 20th century. And the politeness and the florid speech of the characters, even the lower class characters, contributes to this sense of order and comfort. And not only is Barry Lyndon, by comparison, serene and comfortable in terms of what you actually see on the screen, every image is pleasing in Barry Lyndon. Even the battle scenes are beautiful because of the movements of the soldiers and their discipline and heroism and the uniforms looking so cool and showing how the soldiers had to work together to survive. It's very strange that Kubrick can portray violence in two totally different ways. And I think it's because he's showing that the violence that Barry Lyndon was participating in as a red coat and later as a blue coat for the Prussian army, that violence was orderly and sanctioned by a state-level government. And is he sort of saying that that's better than anarchy on the streets? One skilled soldier being shot dead by another skilled soldier to achieve some political purpose is perhaps preferable to a hapless citizen dying on the streets from blunt head trauma because somebody wanted the $85 that they had in their purse. I would agree. I would say you want to eliminate those as much as you can. And so, what is this movie about? What's Barry Lyndon about? Well, Barry Lyndon was born Redmond Barry, and Redmond Barry was a poor Irish kid who grew up on a small farm, and he wants to make something of himself. He reaches for the top. He kind of has nowhere to go but up, because his father died in a duel, and his mother was barely keeping the farm going. Now, what makes Barry originally have to leave his hometown and wander off into the wilder, wider world? Well, it had to do with an incident that happened when he was very young. And I have to clarify something here. Unlike most Irish people, Redmond Barry is quite the hothead. He's pretty good in a fight, especially a fist fight, and he's quick to join one if he feels insulted or if he thinks he can gain something from it. Now, I know this doesn't fit any of the stereotypes associated with people of Irish descent, so it's kind of weird to see this 18th century young Irishman having such a temper and self-destructive pride. But that's the kind of person he is. Now, just like his father, pretty soon into adulthood, he finds himself in a duel, and after the duel, Redmond is forced to leave and try to find safety from law enforcement. So Barry Lyndon is given a bag full of gold coins by his mother, and he packs up his best clothes and the only horse they owned, and he headed for Dublin to get away from the firestorm that he had created. But on his way to Dublin, Barry is relieved of his gold coins by a pair of highwaymen, robbers, who ambush him when he's passing through some dark woods. And I gotta say, in line with Kubrick's theme of the high civilization that we lost, the culture of the past, the comfort that we could find in that culture and that order, with even the robbery, Kubrick underlines that theme, because Redmond is robbed by an older man and his son, who point pistols at him and ask him to get off his horse. And they introduce themselves, and they're downright cordial. But then the old man cocks his pistol and says, "Well, sir, now it's time to move on to the more regrettable portion of our brief acquaintance." And the man's son searches Barry and finds the bag of coins. And Barry, with his hands up in the air, afraid to make a move because of all the guns pointing at him, 4 in fact, Barry chooses to plead with the old man. And Redmond says to the old man, "That's all the money my mother has in the world. Mightn't I be able to keep it? I'm running from the law just like you. I killed an English officer in a duel. Now I'm headed for Dublin." And the old man seemed to be a bit moved by Redmond's story, and he says, "Well, young sir, that's one of the more intriguing stories I've heard in recent years. But alas, a man in my line of work cannot afford to be sentimental," or something to that effect. I don't remember the exact dialogue, but I bet you I'm pretty close. It's a much longer scene, though, because their introductions and their banter is pretty funny, and they're so nice to each other. The robbers do, in the end, feel bad for Redmond, and since he had all that gold on him, they explained to him that they didn't know that he had so much gold on him, and they were planning to take his jacket, his boots, his hat, and his horse. They said that they had to take his horse and the gold, but that given his story and his circumstances, they let him keep his boots and his jacket and his hat and let him proceed to Dublin. And Barry starts walking away into the woods, but Barry keeps his hands up. And so the old man says, "Oh, you can put your hands down now, Mr. Barry." And so Redmond puts his hands down and proceeds to Dublin, now utterly penniless. And so, given Redmond's extreme situation and his desperation, he changes his name and enlists in the English army as a redcoat. Ironically, the same army in which his victim, the English officer, had served. And now Barry trains and is sent over the channel into Europe because the 7 Years' War has broken out. And he ends up fighting in some pitched battles there. Some pretty cool scenes. And what's interesting is that there's another English officer who admires Barry's abilities and his strength. And in a very honest and wholesome and genuine way, he takes Barry under his wing a little bit, and Barry admires him, and it's clear that the man became a bit of a father figure to Barry. Now, I don't want to go on more with the details of the plot, just in case you wanted to watch Barry Lyndon. But Barry does end up being pressed into the Prussian army, which was a very different experience, and it took him into other very strange circumstances. And him being a very able soldier, and very ambitious and clever and brave and motivated, he's noticed by certain Prussian officers who think that he would make a good spy. And so Barry is relieved of his duties as an enlisted man. He puts away his musket and his blue coat, and now he has to pose as a British officer and find himself in the good graces of a French aristocrat. But little do they know that secretly, this French aristocrat is actually Irish. At least he was born in Ireland. He had become quite culturally French, of course. But Barry was sent there to spy on the man. But of course, the fact that they were both Irishmen overrode all their other allegiances, and they started working together and conspiring together to get money and trick everybody else. And so their most profitable scheme was by holding parties where they would have gambling. And the idea was to get these clueless, foppish aristocrats drunk and get them to gamble too much and fall into debt. Of course, these aristocrats would refuse to pay. Redmond, now Barry, would challenge these debtors to duels where they either had to do the honorable thing and pay up, or they had to show up and fight him. And apparently, on the continent of Europe, fighting with blades was preferred. And so there's a cool scene where Barry has a fight with a rapier with this guy. If you're into fencing, it's cool to watch. I did take one semester of fencing. But Barry and this fake aristocrat pocket a lot of money. And during one of these parties, he meets Lady Lyndon. And she is an attractive young aristocrat who is married to this kinda gross, cranky old man, Lord Lyndon, who owns a lot of property and has a title. And even his son, Lady Lyndon's son with this old man, even though he's still a boy, he still has a title, Lord Bullingdon. And so, to sum up the third reel of the movie, Lady Lyndon and Barry become romantically involved. And pretty soon the old man is out of the way. Barry marries the widow, Lyndon, and becomes Barry Lyndon. He takes on this aristocratic name because Redmond Barry pretty obviously shows his low birth. And he does not get along with his stepson, Lord Bullingdon. And Barry reaches the pinnacle of his life when Lady Lyndon bears a son. And of course, Barry dotes on the little boy and spoils him and tells him stories about what he did in the war. And Barry had some genuinely good stories. So before I sum up Barry Lyndon and talk about what I think it means, let me talk about the tent scene. So, I had mentioned that when Barry was in the British Army, he became friendly with a British captain who served as a bit of a mentor for Barry. And there was an important scene that occurred at night inside an army tent where Barry and the captain have a conversation over this little table, and sitting on the little table is one little candle. And that was the only available light in the scene. And so that presented a problem. As I said earlier, Kubrick was determined not to use any artificial light to make the movie, but I did mention that a single candle could not produce enough light to get a good exposure on the film stocks that they had at the time. Kubrick wasn't a brilliant chemist, and so he couldn't come up with a more sensitive film stock for that scene. But he was an old-school photographer who knew the mechanics of how cameras worked. And so he had a special camera built specifically for this one scene. And it was a camera that had a very fast lens. And what that means is a lot of light gets through it, and you can get a better image with a lower light level. And so you may have heard of this concept called f-stops in photography. And it's real simple. An f-stop controls how much light goes into the camera. How big is the aperture that the light is passing through on its way to the film? Or in a digital camera, the CCD, the sensor. And the larger the number, the smaller the hole. And so f22 is about as high as most cameras will go. And that is a tiny, tiny pinhole of light. It needs to be broad daylight, noon in the Caribbean on a clear day, in order to get an image with an aperture that small. Now, as I said, the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. On a typical camera, the largest aperture you can get is 1.8 to 1.2. The camera I had would go down to 1.4. Now, that's going to let in a massive amount of light, but the problem is, the larger that aperture is, the less of the image is going to be in focus. So at f22, everything is in focus. If you were in the Caribbean on that clear day, taking a photo at f22, every single vein of every palm frond is going to be perfectly in focus. Every grain of sand can be seen if you zoom in. And so the problem with a low f-stop number, i.e. a larger aperture, the problem with that is very little of the image is in focus. So at f22, something that's 2 feet away from the camera is perfectly in focus. Something that's 200 feet from the camera is perfectly in focus. At f1.4, something that's 2 feet in front of the camera is completely blurry. Something that is 200 feet from the camera is completely blurry. And pretty much only what you're focused on is in focus. So if someone's standing 10 feet from the camera, you focus on one of their eyes, which is usually the best thing to do. Their whole face and body is going to be nicely in focus. Then everything behind them is going to be sort of soft and fuzzy and blown out. And that looks nice. They call that bokeh. So here's the thing. When you're lighting a scene with just one candle inside a tent, at night in 1974, 1.4 is not big enough. Kubrick had a special camera built that had an aperture that went below 1. Now, what that means is the aperture is the same size as the last lens that the light goes through. And so you're getting a really hazy, blurry image. But you can get that image with very low light. Now, inside this tent, with this special camera, there was a 1-inch wide plane, an imaginary plane that was a very fixed distance from the camera, and the two actors had to act out their scene within this 1-inch plane. All of their movements had to be practiced so that whenever they would engage in their conversation or move their hands, they would stay as close to this imaginary plane of fixed distance from the camera lens, as close to that as possible. So it took a lot of takes, and even in the final film, there's a couple of times where their heads wobble during the conversation, just a little too far or a little too close to the camera. And we're talking about fractions of an inch here. As soon as they deviate that little bit, that part of their face goes completely out of focus. So, that's weird. That's also a little extreme. But I think Kubrick was so determined to accomplish this because the way he lit the movie, the costumes, the sets, I think it all contributes to the theme of Barry Lyndon. I think it all backs up and underlines what Kubrick was trying to say. And so what does Barry Lyndon mean? Well, let's start with that tent. What was going on in that tent? It was an army tent, late at night, where two men who saw eye to eye about life, the older man who represented experience and civilization, and he's mentoring this young man and sort of taking the wildness out of him and showing him a world of self-discipline, of culture. Put this in the context of an unflinching, seamless, and fully realized world. A lost, traditional world. A world of beauty and high civilization and culture and discipline. I think he wants this rough, unmanufactured look, a handmade quality to the film. Because he's trying to evoke a time where you had these quiet nights and dinner parties where you can hear the insects outside. And there's no air conditioning. Everybody's face is painted white with lead oxide because I think titanium dioxide was difficult to make until the 19th century. I mean, when you watch this movie, you can almost smell the perfume and the dusty wigs and the candle smoke. So what I'm trying to say is that A Clockwork Orange was not Kubrick's most subversive or revolutionary movie. I think it was Barry Lyndon. I think that he wanted to show the audience some sort of contrast to the world that he presented in 2001 and A Clockwork Orange. He showed us a future that threatened to end humanity either by actual extinction or by just robbing us of what makes us human. And here with Barry Lyndon, he shows us this 100% human world where people were people. And there was nothing mechanical or anonymous about the world the way things are now, the way they were becoming in the late 20th century. I think there was a kind of cold mechanical inhumanity that Kubrick saw in 20th century America and the world in general. He seemed to have a lot of the same dissatisfaction and critiques of our society that a lot of people on the left had. But I think that ultimately Kubrick thought that we were headed in the wrong direction. Now, if Barry Lyndon was a response to the counterculture, which is what I'm saying, in terms of how the left tends to frame things, you could say that it's a reactionary movie. Because when the right reacts to positions on the left, they consider that reactionary. So you could say that Barry Lyndon is a reactionary film. It's sort of a traditionalist mindset asserting itself right in the middle of this counterculture revolution in the world of film. Kubrick hated postmodernism. I think that shows in this very early modern film where the old traditions and standards still had meaning. a lot of people don't talk about how important the 1970s were to the history of filmmaking. I think all you have to do is watch a few of the typical movies from, say, 1967, and then watch a few movies from 1984, and you'll realize that there's this vast gulf between them. Not just in terms of subject matter, or cultural norms, or fashion, but definitely in terms of filmmaking style. Now, in the information age, we're all used to technological changes coming along, and we see how that can change media. For example, streaming, or just digital photography in general. And we forget that there were technological advances before the 1990s, and part of what changed about filmmaking in the late 1960s and early 1970s was technological. It was new kinds of cameras, new film stocks, new lighting options. And you have to bear in mind that Stanley Kubrick was the first director to use a Steadicam harness in a film, and that was for The Shining. So Kubrick was always looking for the next technological development that could help him realize a film. And that's one of the main reasons why the films from the 1970s have that classic photographed look that's different from the painterly Technicolor look that was prominent in films in the 1960s. There was more realism in the imagery, and you can see that Kubrick enthusiastically leveraged all this new technology to create this very tactile, real world of the past in Barry Lyndon. I think that Barry Lyndon and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are two films that have the best cinematography of all time. So yes, Barry Lyndon and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are awesome movies that anybody interested in photography or cinematography should watch and study. Okay, well, enough about Barry Lyndon for now. And in the next volume on Why Stanley Kubrick, we're going to be talking about two of the big ones, his two final major films. And no, I don't consider Eyes Wide Shut his final film. And we'll talk about why that is. But it's interesting because The Shining has become, I think, Kubrick's most popular film, or at least his most well-known film. But I will join with the other Kubrick fans who regard this as one of his lesser films. It's still awesome, and it still holds up, and it's very haunting, but I don't know if it hangs together the way the other ones do. Kubrick made some very strange choices during the writing and the shooting of The Shining, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll move on to maybe one of my personal favorites of Stanley Kubrick, Full Metal Jacket. That is a doozy, and it has a lot to say about all kinds of things. It also has the best soundtrack of any Kubrick film. Lots of classic rock. And so, in the next volume, we will re-enter the grim, cold world of Stanley Kubrick and talk about, I guess, probably his two most grim and cold movies. They're not as bizarre and disturbing as A Clockwork Orange, but, you know, they hit hard, you remember them, and they say some ugly things about human nature. And they make us reflect on how we fit into the universe. And so, until then, talk to you later.